Hello, and welcome to Revolutionary Ideas, the Marxist podcast from Socialist Alternative. Zarah Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn have recently announced that a new left party in Britain is in the works. Like millions of people, Socialist Alternative are relieved and excited about what this new organisation has in store. We'll be building this party as soon as we have the opportunity to. But we also need to discuss what should it stand for? What does the new party need to be based on? And how can it genuinely put forward the kind of socialist and working class alternative needed to fight Starmer's austerity and the alarming rise of reform? Before I move over to our hosts this episode, Claire and Mike, I just want to plug a couple of things. Our pamphlet, The New Party We Need, produced by Socialist Alternative, is more relevant than ever. To get your copy, go to socialistalternative.info/shop. There you can also get your subscription to our monthly newspaper, which in this issue carries articles on the rise and fall of woke capitalism, the ideas of Lenin today, and the increasing popularity of Gary Stevenson and the call to tax the rich. With that said, let's go over to Claire.
So welcome to today's podcast. I am here with Mike Forster from the People's Alliance for Change and Equality, which has been founded in Huddersfield to help bring together people who want to build an alternative to Labour, to bring together campaigns and so on. I'm Claire Laker-Mansfield, I'm from Socialist Alternative, and Mike is also a member of Socialist Alternative. So in the last 24 hours, we have had this extremely exciting news that Zarah Sultana has announced online, on Facebook, Twitter, and so on, that she will be co-leading the founding of a new left party with Jeremy Corbyn. And she's released a really combative statement declaring that in this period it's socialism or barbarism, and that we need a party that will stand for the working class as opposed to the billionaires. So I think both me and you, Mike, are really excited by that. I know that you have been involved via PACE and via Collective in some of those discussions about founding it. So I don't know if you want to maybe just say a few words about that news.
Well, I think it's great news. Zarah Sultana, as we know, had been suspended from the Labour Party. It was unclear whether she was going to be readmitted, but has consistently opposed the right-wing drift of the Labour Party and particularly its pro-austerity policies, and had made it very clear that she didn't regret the winter fuel allowance vote, and she certainly would not be endorsing their cuts to welfare benefits. So I think that was a defining moment for her in Parliament, when Labour has now become the party that decides to attack the poorest sections of society, and shows encouraged by the fact that even though the party has not yet been formally launched, already in official polling, people are being asked, would you support this party if it was set up? And 10% have indicated that they would vote for it. The working class needs a political voice. It is no longer represented in Britain, and we're hoping that this party will offer that opportunity and begin to coordinate and organise the resistance.
It almost feels like a bit of a relief that finally there's going to be something which we can get behind, which offers an alternative to what's, frankly, a terrible government. I mean, there's no other way of describing it. Obviously, this week we've had what's described using that phrase that you, I think that originated in the thick of it, actually, of omni-shambles, with all of the wrangling over the welfare bill. In some ways, I think this is the perfect week to launch the new party. It's also 1 year now since Labour took power. They've had a year to show, if you like, what kind of government they are, and they have done that. I mean, what are your thoughts on Labour in power, and why that has made it clearer to more people that we need this new party?
Well, obviously, this time last year, we were all relieved that we'd seen the back of the Tory government. And because of the way in which the electoral system is organised in this country, then Labour commanded a majority which was much greater than the votes that it received at the ballot box. The anti-Tory vote was split many different ways, and Labour benefited from that. In fact, in 2019 and in 2017, Jeremy Corbyn got more votes than Keir Starmer in both of those elections. Now we're at a point where we've had a Labour government for a year, and it's been a huge disappointment. Some of us were aware that Starmer was coming from the right of the party, but even those of us who could see the direction of political travel of Keir Starmer, we have been surprised really by the rapidity with which Starmer has chosen to tack to the right. One of the first things they did was to remove the winter fuel allowance, around which they've just now had to backtrack. They refused to lift the two-child benefit cap, and horrifyingly, then they have actually sent more weapons to Israel in the last 6 months than the period of the last Conservative government, whilst at the same time claiming that they're in favour of human rights. And then, of course, as you say, we've had the farce around welfare reform. And in all the by-elections and opinion polls, Labour is tanking. But more importantly than opinion polls and the performance of political leaders, we have to look to ordinary working people who had high hopes and illusions, of course, in this Labour government. And what they've seen instead is a government that has continued to attack both their living standards and their working conditions, and those who are on benefits attacking their benefits without signalling anything that looks radically different from the usual political class. And so Labour is now lumped in with all the other parties as being politicians are all the same. What's the point of this lot? And it has given rise, which I'm sure we'll talk about, to the sudden emergence and rise in popularity for Reform UK, which is a much bigger threat to us than the Tory party. I would argue that Labour has prepared the subsoil from which Reform has been able to grow. And without there being a left-wing socialist alternative to this Labour government, then unfortunately many people will be seduced into the populist policies of Reform UK.
Maybe just tracking back a little bit, I think one of the things that you touched on there is the question of foreign policy and the complicity of this Labour government in a genocidal war. I think one of the things that's sort of interesting, if you're looking at the way in which this new party has emerged, perhaps surprisingly, the kind of first triggers for it, or the first signs that something like this might be in the offing and start to develop, probably came, I would say, before the last election, and particularly surrounding the successful campaigns in a number of constituencies for anti-war candidates, independents, including Jeremy Corbyn, of course, although, I think we wouldn't necessarily put him in quite the same category because he has a long history as leader of the Labour Party and so on. But alongside Jeremy Corbyn, there were 4 other MPs who won their seats standing as anti-war candidates, opposing particularly the slaughtering in Gaza and the completely cowardly, even that's probably too kind, really, the terrible position that Labour had taken on it, supporting the Israeli regime, failing to call for a ceasefire at first, continuing to arm them, etc. So that's been an interesting dynamic. And I think, in the world that we're living in, where militarism and those kinds of things are on the rise, perhaps it's not surprising that that's been one of the key dividing lines early on. Would you agree with that?
Yes, very simply. We, of course, now the independent group has swollen by 1 more, which makes them a bigger political group in Parliament than Reform UK. And we would hope the signal that Zarah Sultana has sent today, coming out in favour of the new party and resigning from the Labour Party, that other Labour MPs, particularly those who are being suspended, will consider their position and realise that they're on the wrong side of history. And that side of history is of course, running against the Labour Party. One of Starmer's first important priorities in foreign policy was to cozy up to Donald Trump. And the spectacle of him finding Donald Trump to be a great ally, when we see, of course, what he's doing in America, which I don't need to go into any detail, but appalling attacks on civil liberties and workers' rights, as well as perpetrating the genocide in Gaza. And yet, strangely enough, Starmer has found him to be his preferred bedtime ally. Now, there's no way in which we could give any succor to a right-wing authoritarian, increasingly dictator in America, and yet Starmer has chosen to pivot in that direction. And what he's doing in foreign policy, he's continuing in domestic policy. I'm from an area in Kirklees where we were fortunate to have one of the 4 independent MPs elected at the general election. And of course, Iqbal Mohammed was elected on a very clear pro-Palestine anti-war platform. And the support that he received was building on the support that other independent councillors had also received in the local elections only a few months prior to the general election, where there was a clean sweep for the independents in the constituency where he was standing. So a lot of the groundwork was done, and we were obviously active in that area and could see the groundswell of support. But one independent councillor put it very well. Gaza has actually awoken the electorate. And so with their eyes open, they're beginning to look at what the other political parties are doing, as well as what Labour stands for. So in reality, although the touchstone began with Gaza, it has continued on all the other issues, the social issues that we've already touched upon, which has lit the fire really of resistance. And I think Sultana's call will continue to see those flames burn, and hopefully we're going to see the emergence of a mass left force in this country.
I guess that might be an opportunity maybe to just say briefly how PACE came about and how we kind of see initiatives like that hopefully fitting into what we are anticipating as the imminent launch of something new.
Well, we called a conference of resistance, we began the call last year. And as I said at the conference, this is a town that is not a conference of surrender. This is a conference of resistance. We circulated a proposal to hold that conference based upon an alliance of resistance, actually even before the general election, because we could see the way in which the ground was moving. And we've been very fortunate in this town to have a whole number of campaigns that have been successful in fighting back cuts, closures, and threats of privatisation. The blue jacket that I'm wearing today is the jacket of the Hands Off HRI campaign, where over a 4-year-long period, we were able to push back the NHS Trust and prevent the closure of our hospital and our accidental emergency, which mobilised literally tens of thousands of people in the town of Huddersfield to ensure that we maintained full NHS services. And that really showed that if you fight, you can win. Mm-hmm. And it gave encouragement to others who were moving into struggle. So it was no surprise. One of the leaders of the Freedom for Palestine movement had been part of Hands Off HRI, that we were invited to become involved in that campaign. We would have done so anyway, but it played one of the leading roles in assisting the Huddersfield Freedom for Palestine in establishing a presence in this town over the last 18 months. But also Kirklees Council has chosen, like all other Labour councils, unfortunately, to embark on a programme of cuts and closures. They were proposing to close 7 leisure centres, and they also wanted to close the last 2 remaining specialist dementia care homes in the area. And we initiated, with one of the independent councillors, a campaign group called Stop the Cuts. Obviously, there isn't time to go into all of that, but we were successful in ensuring that we kept open 4.5 leisure centres and we stopped the closure of the dementia care homes. In addition to that, we have also been instrumental in launching Alternative Pride in the town, and we've helped to mobilise a whole number of youth who feel completely alienated by the transphobic comments of Keir Starmer and the actions of the government in going along with the Supreme Court ruling that in reality is attempting to outlaw trans rights. And we've mobilised some very politicised young people who have reached a large constituency of youth in the town who are ready to resist and fight back. And we only had a demonstration last week of just over 60 young people, all of whom were under the age of 18. So we pulled together all of these different campaigns into one alliance. And we've been meeting for the last year or so, putting together a programme of activity, putting together a schedule as to how we would launch the conference, organising the speakers and obviously publicising the event. Hugely successful conference with over 200 in attendance. massively enthusiastic for the call for a new left party, which helped, I think, to encourage Jeremy Corbyn to echo that call at the conference and to say that something would be in place within the next 12 months. And as we can see now, something is in place within those 12 months.
I think that actually connects a little bit with what we as Socialist Alternative have been arguing the kind of approach of a new left party needs to be, because I think one of the kind of conceptions that there can be of what party should be focused on is that it should be electoral, that there should be a sort of separation almost between all of these different campaigns and fightbacks and struggles, that they should somehow be in sort of one corner, and that the party should be doing its electoral work separate to that. And we have kind of had an emphasis on, actually, that's not the way forward. What we need is a party that's going to become like a hub for people who are fighting back in different arenas, people who are on strike, people who are campaigning on local cuts and closures, people who are fighting against climate change, or who are campaigning against the war. So I think we in on a small scale, what PACE has done is sort of modelled how that can look in practice, and to my mind, it's sort of something that we are putting forward as a kind of model to be adopted more nationally, to make this like a party of struggle, a party of people who are fighting back, a party that's organising day to day. Of course, that stands in elections. That's going to be an important part of what the new party is for. We need a challenge electorally to the Labour Party and to Reform, as you rightly point out. But it's also got to be a party that's alive and breathing and part of people's struggles and fights on a day-to-day basis. Maybe that's a moment to start thinking a little bit more about what this new party might look like and what it should look like. And we don't necessarily know yet exactly on what basis it's going to be set up. Like, we're at an early stage in this process when we're recording this podcast. We've just had this announcement from Zarah Sultana. We're waiting to see, whether there's going to be an opportunity for individuals to sign up to the party, whether there's going to be a conference called, which I think there needs to be pretty rapidly, really, so that we can allow ordinary people, working class people, socialist groups, trade unions, and people like that to be brought together and to have a bit more of a democratic say in how it's going to look and what it should stand for. What do you think are some of the key things?
Well, when Jeremy Corbyn was approached to help initiate a new party, he was wanting assurance that there would be support for what we would be doing on the ground, and therefore called for assemblies to be organised all over the country. And that appears to be a bit of a model that is now developing and being rolled out, and there have been some huge rallies. And I think that is the first prerequisite to the success of a party. It can't be a top-down structure. What it needs to be is a party that's built from below, with the enthusiastic support of people in every village, town and city. When you're bringing that many people together, it is then essential to ensure that it becomes organised. And for a party to be organised, and not where it receives preordained orders from above, but it's a party that's organised democratically, where there is accountability built into its structures, and where there is transparency. And so certainly following our conference, we have elected a committee and made it clear that there will be a process of recall, that there will be regular elections, and that we will share all of the decisions that the committee is making and seek approval for what we're doing. And that model, I think, is really the kind of way in which the new party has to be built. So I would suggest that the next step is a national conference is called, that all groups and individuals are invited to attend on a delegate basis, and that a programme is agreed and hammered out, and national leadership is elected, and clearly a strategic way forward. And you've mentioned, Claire, is this going to be electoral, or is it going to be built on struggle? And in reality, it needs to be both, but one will feed into the other and they'll interact with each other.
Mhm.
So coming back to our local model, we have two subgroups, one of which is dealing with local mobilisations, seeking to involve more groups and reaching out to individuals who we've not yet engaged with. And the other commit subgroup is looking at an electoral strategy and seeking to identify candidates, seeking to ratify candidates, and of course to get registered with the Electoral Commission. So these are all things that have to be done, in my opinion, by a new party. But the essential prerequisite, I think, has to be, if we're not going to do things in the old way, there's got to be democracy and accountability.
I think that's an interesting point, actually, because one of the things that some people can perhaps be wary of is like the idea that there is in capitalist parties of the party whip. And I think that the party whip in a capitalist party is essentially the bourgeois whip, if you like, the capitalist whip, because it's used to crack down on MPs who are looking to, you know, perhaps vote in a way which is more in line with the interests of workers, frankly. So, I mean, just this week we've had this debacle in the Labour Party where it was reported, before they had to make all these retreats on the welfare reform, it was reported that the whips and the Labour whips were going around threatening people and saying that, they were going to withdraw the whip from a certain number of MPs every day until everyone else came into the line, and all this kind of macho sort of language around it. So, I mean, of course, we would oppose that kind of so-called, whipping, as the terminology is. However, I think that there is maybe something different that we do need within a new workers' party, which is kind of in a certain sense the opposite of that. But you need the workers' whip, if you want to put it like that. That you need workers who are part of the new party, activists, campaigners, people who are involved, to be able to exercise control over what the people who are there representing them in Parliament are doing and saying. Not as in, to such a rigid degree that, everything that they say is having to be approved by committee or something like that. Of course not. But on key votes, which are about really important issues for working class people, it shouldn't just be up to individual MPs to vote however they feel on a particular day. It should be about what's really in the interest of the majority of working class people, what's democratically been agreed, and that kind of thing. So I think that maybe could become a little bit of a point of discussion within a new party, and something which we can contribute on, I guess. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and when you mentioned the workers' whip, I mean, the spectacle of Starmer's forced retreat indicated a couple of things that we would, of course, not wish to see in a new formation. The first was that he was completely out of touch. While he was abroad at different summits, the United Nations and so on, he was saying that these were just noises off, and that they would have the vote, which took place last Tuesday, and that he was comfortable about how it would proceed. The other thing was completely failing to understand and grasp the huge implications for these cuts that would have on the poorest sections of society. So on his return to Britain, he was being advised that Labour MPs were in revolt. Why were they in revolt, and what threats were being made to them, I think, is also important. They were in revolt because they'd been besieged, first of all, by disgruntled Labour Party members, which might come as a bit of a surprise given how much the Labour Party has shrunk. But they, in turn, were understanding the huge pressure that they were coming under from ordinary members of the public, and particularly from the effective campaigns coordinated by Disabled People Against the Cuts, DPAC. So the MPs, tired of being treated like children, decided that enough was enough. And the threats that were made to them was to their careers. You won't get any further advancement, you won't be selected, and you may have the whip removed from you. And that failed. So there's an instructive lesson there, isn't there? If you're going to have a bottom-up party and not one that's dictated from the top, even those hand-selected MPs have said, You can't rule us in the old way. Things have to be done differently if you require our support. For a new party, there would need to be discipline, but discipline can only be introduced where there is agreement, and that can only be undertaken through democracy. So the cornerstone of a new party is its democracy. And where there is recall over elected representatives, and also where there are regular elections, and where worker MPs, councillors, representatives are paid the average wage of the people that they represent, that builds into the foundations of the party, not an absolute guarantee, but at least a constitutional guarantee that representatives can't just wander off and do their own thing. So a new party has to be built on the principle of democracy. And yes, there would need to be discipline when we're in meetings where the new party will have to vote on issues, but you would hope that the membership will have clarified those issues. There will be an agreed programme, and it's just a matter of following the agreed policy and programme that hopefully will come through the democratic structures of a new formation.
Yeah, definitely. I guess that you would imagine that there will be some debates in the early part of this party and probably throughout its lifetime about the kind of programme that we need. And I think this is something that Socialist Alternative has quite a firm view on. And I also think that this maybe relates a little bit to what some of the experiences have been recently in our history, both in this country and internationally, where we've had left leaders, left parties, which have in some cases done quite well. Obviously, Corbyn himself, as leader of the Labour Party, was incredibly popular and came very close to winning an election in 2017. I think that one of the things that perhaps is a lesson from Corbynism was that the attempt, I suppose, that Corbyn and some of those around him tried to sort of square the circle to say, well, we can be in the leadership of Labour, but we can continue to work with, or at least to accommodate, all of the old Blairite leaders of the Labour Party and MPs and so on. And what happened was that actually, unfortunately, they waged a ferocious and unending war against Jeremy, and it was what ultimately led really to the 2019 election defeat. But equally, I think, perhaps slightly different context, but I think that we saw that kind of ferocity in examples like Greece, where Syriza came to power in 2015 on a mandate of no more austerity, and that the kind of the Troika, as it was called at the time, the European Central Bank, the EU Commission and the IMF basically ganged up on them and threatened to plunge the Greek economy into chaos. And the result of it was that ultimately Tsipras, the Greek Prime Minister, basically capitulated and ended up implementing cuts. So it's like there's this history, isn't there? And I think that does relate a little bit to what we're saying about programme. These two things aren't separate for us. Would you maybe want to touch on that a little bit?
Yes, and some of the examples that I would have given you've already mentioned. There was, similar optimism, particularly in 2017 or 2016 when Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader, and then we had the opportunity of a general election. And I would say he was probably a week away from winning that general election. It was a very short campaign that Theresa May called, and there was massive momentum. And we saw particularly the enthusiasm of young people who had never come across in their lifetime these ideas of anti-austerity and pro-socialism. So it was significant and important that we had those ideas coming out into the open for the first time. It has since emerged, of course, that Corbyn's campaign was being sabotaged by the bureaucracy inside the Labour Party and also by the Parliamentary Labour Party, who were hoping and wishing that there would be a Tory victory, unbelievably, so that they could get rid of Corbyn. There were 2 votes of no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn whilst he was leader of the Labour Party from his own backbenchers, both of which were unsuccessful. What needed to have happened in the Labour Party was that all of these right-wing parliamentarians be dealt with. There should have been a change to the Labour Party constitution, the introduction of immediate recall and compulsory reselection conferences, so that Labour parties that had swollen to massive numbers, where Labour's national membership was somewhere approaching 600,000, where those members could have selected left-wing MPs. And because that nettle wasn't grasped, unfortunately, the right-wing elements inside the Parliamentary Labour Party, led by Tom Watson, executed what they called the Anaconda strategy, which was to slowly strangulate Corbyn until he was neutered. And therefore, in the following election in 2019, we had a very bold election manifesto, but on the question of Brexit, there was a fudge where there was an attempted compromise with the right wing of the Parliamentary Labour Party. And that meant that Labour came across as both weak and confused, and unfortunately lost the election to probably one of the worst prime ministers that Britain ever seen in the form of Boris Johnson. So that has to be avoided. And it can only be avoided by adopting bold socialist policies, sticking to those principles, communicating them effectively with the broader working class and the electorate, so that Labour can both win power and remain in power. Well, not Labour, but the New Left Party.
One of the lessons of all these kind of examples is that the rich and powerful will use their power to attack any kind of government which is threatening their interests, basically. And I suppose what we mean by that means you need socialist policies is that you actually have to have policies, and not just policies, but an approach, a strategy, which mobilises workers' power and which is prepared to try and take that wealth and power off those people by, for example, nationalisation. So, I think it's uncontroversial, really, that we need nationalisation of utilities, of water, of some of those things. But I think we would go a bit further than that, really, and say, well, actually, some of these huge monopolies that exist in our society, which actually control a lot of our lives in many different ways, which we, almost don't notice because it's just so ingrained into how society works. But there are these huge monopolies, and the people who are, the big shareholders and the owners of those companies and the top executives and so on, they've got all of this power, which no one has elected them to. They've just got it by dint of owning all this stuff. And so we would say, actually, we need to dismantle those sort of structures by nationalising those monopolies under democratic workers' control and bringing workers in to run society, to democratically plan the economy. That's kind of what we mean, I think. And do you think that would be a popular sort of programme within the new party? Is it something that you think working class people can be won over to?
I think it's worth reflecting on the dilemma that Labour's got itself in now, where they are claiming they have to make more cuts in order to plug a £5 billion deficit as a result of not getting their welfare reforms through Parliament. Now, the only reason that the Chancellor is sticking to these so-called fiscal rules is that's the dictatorship of the bond markets, who are threatening to undermine and jeopardise sterling and the pound and the stock markets, and through that also the huge government debt, which would see interest rates going up even further, which they're having to pay off to the tune of £100 billion a year. So yes, you take the example of the water bosses in the country who are making or have awarded themselves over the last 5 years almost £5 billion in additional pay and bonuses, and yet they continue to discharge effluent into our rivers and sea. And of course, water bills are going up. You could repeat that across all of the former public services, whether it's rail, transport, utilities, energy, gas, you name it. And if we went to the public and said that we want to renationalise or nationalise these services, there would be overwhelming, massive support. There is huge anger about the way in which our water industry is being run. Individual wealth in this country, well, internationally, I should say, of the top billionaires increased by £6.2 billion over the last year. So the idea of a wealth tax is hugely popular, and we would want to ensure that that money was taken off of the wealthy and put into ordinary working people's hands. The banks and finance companies, the supermarkets, they're all bleeding this country dry. So we would want to see them brought into public ownership. The fact that this government is paying £100 billion a year in interest on the loans that they've taken out to finance public services, and in particular, the money that was injected into during the COVID crisis into public services, and we're now having to pay for that. And they have not been affected one iota. Their profits have continued to increase. You explain that, people will be very supportive. It's policies like that, along with a program of peace rather than war, welfare rather than warfare, I think would have huge public support. And the public are ready, the working class is ready for that kind of radical socialist program.
I think one of the retorts that you often hear when people go on the television and they say we need a wealth tax rather than taking money off the poorest people in society, let's take it off the richest. One of the things that they often hear back is, oh, well, if you do that, then the rich will just take their money out of the country. And I guess that's why a programme which includes things like nationalising the banks is essential, because if you have control over the banks, and obviously you don't control what you don't own, if you nationalise them, then you can quite clearly see where people are taking their money. You can bring in capital controls and so on, and that can prevent that sort of sabotage, if you like, from being able to go ahead. I feel like we should maybe try and draw this to a bit of a conclusion now, but there's one thing which we have only really touched on very briefly, which I think is quite pertinent to why this new party is necessary, but also to what the challenges are it's facing. Because I think we agree that this is going to be a popular party. It's going to grow in support very rapidly. Lots of people will want to join it, assuming that the doors are thrown open, which we say that they should be. But the most popular party currently in British politics, according to the polls, and obviously there's always movement in those, and we don't want to completely take all of that at face value, but it's certainly clear that they are gaining in support, and that is Reform. And they are kind of offering snake oil, I guess, really, to working class people. They're saying we've got the solutions, and really what they're offering is a scapegoat, or scapegoats, saying that it's the fault of migrants. It's because we've gone too far on LGBT rights, or it's because of these people, and who they are pointing the finger at are some of the most marginalised and oppressed people. Do we think that a new party can cut across that? And what does it need to do in order to be effective? Because it's not automatic that a new party will take support from Reform. I think some of those early polls are not necessarily showing that there's going to be a clear pull away from Reform voters towards the New Left Party. I think that we would say it should be possible for them to do that. But do you want to maybe say something on those points?
Well, of course, this isn't just a national, but it's an international phenomenon, the rise of the populist right. Which requires a lot more detailed analysis, which Socialist Alternative has undertaken, into why this is taking place, but largely because of the failure of, one, the political capitalist system, and two, the established two-party system that we've endured for the last century. People are fed up with it, combined, of course, with a massive cost of living crisis. And any populist leader that comes across as being somehow different, radically different, outside of the box, no longer part of the status quo, which of course is risible given that Farage himself is a millionaire and a merchant banker. But nevertheless, they can portray themselves as something different. And many working people are saying, well, I'm going to try this lot out because I've tried the others and they've let us down badly. So the way that we counter that, of course, is obviously facing up to it, telling the truth and countering the far right, without making concessions to them, without feeling that we have to copy their propaganda. But unfortunately, yes, Reform UK has benefited, not just in the polls, but in recent by-election results. They have benefited from Labour's handling of the whole situation over the last 12 months. And reform will have to be dealt with, both politically in terms of the need for a new party, but also on the streets where they attack migrant communities. We have to come to their defence.
I think that's completely right. It's two-pronged, isn't it? It's both challenging the lie that the reason for working class people having a cost of living crisis is that too many migrants have come here, and pointing to the erosion of wages and conditions and how that's linked to the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, the erosion of trade union rights, the attacks that there have been on the workers' movement over decades, actually, which have allowed that kind of driving down of wages and conditions. It's both pointing that out, being part of fighting against it in a clear way, like being part of helping workers to get organised, to demand better wages, to demand an end to job losses or whatever the kind of question may be. It's being part of that struggle to improve people's everyday lives. And then at the same time, it's also just not giving an inch to the idea that, the problem is trans people, the problem is immigrants, the problem is whoever the scapegoat of the day may be, and challenging that and saying that isn't an acceptable answer to these questions, and it's not something that we want to grow in our society. Maybe that's a good place to end this. I think we've had a really wide-ranging discussion, and this will continue. I know that we are hopefully going to be able to bring out another one of these, also focused on the new party, maybe with some extra guests who might want to join this discussion with slightly different points of view, perhaps to where we're coming from. So thank you so much, Mike, for your time. I know you've been very busy the last couple of days.
Well, that's fine. I think we're living in very exciting times.
Yeah.
And, we're all very excited about the prospect of the new party, which has just taken a leap forward. So obviously, for those people who are tuning in to this podcast, then I would encourage them to join that party, but also to join with Socialist Alternative, which will be and is the cutting edge behind the drive for a new party and the socialist voice within inside a new formation when it's finally set up.
Thanks to Claire and Mike for this excellent episode of Revolutionary Ideas. If you agree with the Marxist ideas and analysis in this podcast, why don't you take the next step and join us? We're looking for new people to get involved with us in fighting for a fundamentally different kind of society, a socialist one. If you're interested, go to socialistalternative.info and click Get Involved. Also follow us on social media. On Instagram, we're socialistalternative.ews. On X, formerly known as Twitter, we're socialistaltews. And on Facebook, we're Socialist Alternative, ISA, England, Wales and Scotland. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.